All right, what's up, guys? This is Nick with Late Night Chess, and we're finishing up our Knight versus Pawn Endgame series. So you guys went through 4 videos going through different Knight versus Pawn Endgame concepts, and so what we're going to do in this video is test for your understanding. So I've got 3 puzzles here that should help reinforce the concepts that we learned in the last 4 videos, and really confirm whether or not you've been able to understand and absorb the material that I presented in this series. So what I'm going to have you guys do in a second is try and solve these puzzles, and then we'll go through each one of them one by one and walk through what the solutions are and how it reinforces some of the concepts that we learned in one of the 4 videos that I posted. So just as a note, the pawns are actually moving down the board, so those black pawns are very close to being promoted in all 3 of those puzzles. So just keep that in mind. The pawns are not going up, they're going down the board. Like in that first example, the black pawn is 1 square away from promoting. So what I'm going to suggest you do now is pause the video and see if you can try and solve each one of these puzzles. The first one is white to move and draw. The second is black to move and win. And the third is white to move and win. So pause the video and then we'll go over each one of the examples. All right, so hopefully you were able to try and solve each one of the puzzles and you have a candidate solution. So let's switch views here real quick and we'll go through each one of them. So let's go through the first puzzle really quickly. So this one should be hopefully the easiest of the 3 puzzles for you to solve. Black's pawn is 1 square away from promotion, and the white knight needs to move in and stop that pawn from promoting. And if you remember the idea of the barrier, the move will be pretty obvious for you. It's knight g3. And if you remember, I think it was video 2 where we walked through the idea of the knight creating a barrier when the rook pawn is 1 square away. The knight creates this L-shaped barrier and prevents the black king from being able to quickly attack the white knight, and white's king will have enough time to come in and defend. So just to show an example, if black were to try and come, so actually let's pull the barrier up one more time. So what's black's best try here? Well, black's best try is to come to d1, e1, and then f2, and hopefully harass this knight. And then maybe try and promote the pawn. But that just takes way too much time. As black is doing this, white's going to be able to bring in his king and defend the knight. So there's no way the black king's going to be able to come around to attack the knight. And if black were to try the more ambitious king c3, that's going to take even longer. So if you remember the barrier again, if black is trying to come to d4, e5, and then f4 to attack the knight, that's just going to take way too much time because king d6, and after king d4, king e6, and now there's just so many squares the black king can't come to, right? So the black king can't come to these 2 squares because the white king is guarding it. The king can't come to any of these squares because of the barrier, and so the king really is boxed in. And I think these red squares do a really good job of visualizing that point, right? So if we just go back to the solution again, knight g3 is the right answer, and knight f2 doesn't work because it doesn't create a barrier. If you remember when the knight was on g3, we had this L-shaped barrier, but now that barrier doesn't exist because this king can now come to d2. He can easily come to d2. There's no fork. There's no threat of the knight taking the pawn. And black will be able to eventually move his king up the board and escort the pawn to becoming a queen. So if you found the move knight g3, good job. That means that you were able to identify this as a barrier problem, and that the knight coming to g3 prevents the king from coming especially to these 2 key squares, as there's always a threat of a knight fork picking up the black pawn. So the second one, this one is actually not a knight versus pawn endgame. It's really a knight and pawn versus king endgame, but it does reinforce another barrier concept that I thought was really helpful. So the right solution to this problem is actually knight e2. And this creates another really powerful visual. So if the knight comes to e2, I'm just going to highlight all of the squares the king cannot go to. So obviously the king can't come to g3 or g1 because the knight is attacking those squares. The white king can also not come to g2 because the pawn on h3 is stopping him. And then also the king cannot go anywhere to the left. He can't come to any of these squares because as soon as he moves to either e1, e2, or e3, this pawn is now going to be able to promote, and the king can't stop. And the white king can't stop the pawn from promoting. So even though it looks like white has quite a few moves here, these all seem like legal and reasonable moves, really the only two moves that the white king has are f3 and f1, and he's just going to be shuffling back and forth among these squares until the black king can come in and get in the game. So it might look something like king f3, king g7, a little bit of a dance back and forth until the black king gets far enough up the board. And then finally here, the king has really no choice but to go to either e2 or e1. And so after the king takes the knight, now this is going to be a simple win for black, just escorting that pawn down the board. So yeah, it's a little bit of a counterintuitive move. At first glance, this seems really strange. It seems like you're just giving up a knight, and the white king is so close to the pawn that he's going to be able to stop it, but he's really not. There's a really cool barrier idea here, and there's that theme pops up a lot in knight and pawn endgames, with the knight trying to prevent the king from getting into certain key squares like we see here. So I think this is a pretty good example. Obviously, if we go back, h2 is a losing, or not a losing move, but it's a bad move for black. Black goes from a winning position to a drawing position simply because obviously king g2, and if you move to f3 trying to guard this pawn, really black is not going to be able to make any progress here. The king's going to have to shuffle between g2 and h1, and as the black king gets closer, we actually get into a spot here where really the black king would like to move to either g3 or h3 to defend this pawn. That way this knight can be freed up to move around, but either one of these squares immediately causes stalemate, right? So if king h3, it's stalemate. There's no squares that the king can legally move to, and the king's not in check. So this is just a stalemate. So yeah, really the knight e2 move is the critical move here, and really reinforces the power of creating barriers for kings and not permitting them to come to certain squares. Okay, and then the last puzzle, which is, by far the trickiest puzzle, I think, is hopefully after you watched my fourth video where we went over knight versus king checkmates, we saw this really cool theme of when the black's king is in the corner, be it h1 or really any of the corners, and the black pawn is smothering the own king, the white knight can deliver mate on, in this case, g3. And so when we look at this position, it kind of has those themes or those patterns kind of brewing. And all we have to do is force black into that position and deliver checkmate. Now, this was a tough one, though, because the winning move is actually king f3. I think the most natural looking move is actually king f2. So let's take a look at that real quick and see why that actually doesn't win. So after king f2, black only has one legal move, king h1. And if you remember, white's knight needs to deliver mate on g3. That's how white's going to win this, is he wants black to have his pawn on h2, and then white needs to be able to mate on g3. But the problem is here it's white's move. And so either the white knight has to move somewhere and then can no longer deliver checkmate on g3. Say, for example, after knight f4, well, then the pawn can just simply come to h2, and it's a stalemate. It's going to be a stalemate after the next move. And if the knight comes to, say, g3 to deliver check, well, then just king h2. White really has nothing better to come back, and we're just repeating the position. So there's really nothing good that comes out of this king f2 move, because we need to be able to deliver mate on g3 as soon as black has pushed his pawn to h2. So king f3 actually kind of passes the turn to black. Notice how the white knight is stopping the black king from coming to g1. So black still only has one legal move, coming to h1. And now we bring the king in to f2. And then after the only legal move, king h2, this is probably the hardest move to find, and it's knight c3. And this move will make more sense after we look at the next move that black makes. So black only has one legal move, and that's king h1. And now let's think about this position for a second. If it's white's move, and if white could just magically take this knight and put him on any square, think about what square you would want the white knight to be on. You'd want him to be on f1. Because if you could just magically move the knight to f1 and it was black's move, black would have only one legal move, which is h2, and then the knight on f1 can deliver mate on g3. So coming to c3, white plans to essentially orient his knight to get to f1, but he needs to do it in such a way that if black ever pushes the pawn to h2, the knight can deliver mate on g3 immediately. And so after knight c3, there's two possible moves. So after knight c3, black only has one move. It's coming to h1. And now white needs to orient his knight in a way to get to f1. But there's a lot of ways he could do that. For example, he could come to b1. But the problem with coming to b1 is black has h2 and white is not able to deliver mate on g3. So he needs to orient his knight in a way that he can always get to g3 in one move if black decides to push the pawn. And so for that reason, the knight comes to e4 with the idea of eventually coming to d2 and f1. But if black were to, for some reason, decide to play h2 here, then white can deliver mate on g3 immediately. So after knight e4, the way to kind of carry this on a little bit longer is for the king to come to h2. And now the knight's free to come to d2, eyeing on that f1 square that we discussed earlier. And after king h1, now knight f1. And we have that position earlier that I said, if you could place the knight anywhere on the board, where would you place him? Well, I'd place him on f1, because now black only has one legal move, which is pawn to h2. And now the knight can deliver mate on g3. So a very complicated one. This was definitely the hardest of the three puzzles, but it does employ the idea of trying to get black to smother himself so we can deliver mate, in this case on g3. So that's kind of hard to see in this position at the beginning, but it kind of has those, I guess, it kind of rhymes of that position that we saw on the fourth video of the idea of the king in the corner and the pawn being smothered. And white has to think of a creative way to do that. So again, king f3, black goes to h1. Now we come to f2, and now the knight is free to eventually orient himself to f1 via e4. Again, notice if the pawn comes to h2, in this case, then white can just simply deliver mate immediately on g3. So, okay, so that was the three puzzles I wanted to share with you guys. Hopefully you guys found this series to be really informative and educational. Again, I know knight and pawn endgames don't show up a lot, but I really believe that going over them and studying them will not just help you in knight versus pawn endgames, but to also be more comfortable and confident when you're getting into endgames with knights, and more easily being able to see different squares and different positions that your knight can get in. So thanks everyone for going through this series. Stay tuned. I'm going to be putting together another series. I haven't decided yet which endgame type that I want to go through, but I'm going to have something similar where I'll do 3 or 4 videos on a certain theme of endgame, and then we'll end it with a couple of puzzles for you to go over. So if you have any ideas or suggestions on which endgames you want me to post next, feel free to submit a post in the comment section, and I'll consider that for the next one. So thanks everyone. Appreciate it again, and have a good night.